Welcome to another one of our Six Questions podcast. I'm Trent England with Save Our State. Very glad to welcome one of my colleagues to the program. Sean Parnell is the Senior Legislative Director for Save Our State. He has spent years traveling the entire country, meeting with state legislators, talking with legislators and their staff and other folks around state capitals about the importance of the Electoral College, the problems with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So Sean has just an incredible wealth of knowledge about all of this and about how presidential elections actually work. We're going to get into that because there's a lot that people just miss about the details, the intricacies, the things that happen behind the scenes, mostly between election day and the time a new president is actually inaugurated, that actually make the National Popular Vote scheme even more dangerous than it might otherwise be. So, Sean Parnell, thank you so much for joining me on Six Questions.
Glad to be here.
So, I want to start off asking you about National Popular Vote talking points, because sometimes they sound plausible, and I want to get from you what they say. But I think we should probably start for folks just with a little refresher on what is the National Popular Vote Compact. I mean, it's this campaign that's been around since 2006, trying to get states to give away their electoral votes by choosing presidential electors based not on what people in their own state want, but based on the National Popular Vote total. So this is a scheme to try to hijack the Electoral College. They're out there, they're lobbying all around the country. Sean, you're out there trying to explain to legislators why this is so dangerous. But what are the NPV talking points that actually can sound plausible in the moment, at least, to legislators?
Sure. And a lot of their talking points, there's usually a grain of truth, and there's a lot of fluff and hyperbole and inaccuracy wrapped around what it is that they're saying. But generally, their talking points aim to make it sound like National Popular Vote. This is a better form of democracy, that more people will be involved, more people will turn out. We'll have a fair political system. And because state legislators are very busy individuals, the Electoral College is, and I'm not real happy about this, but this is the 40th most important issue on most state legislators' agenda. So, they hear a couple of semi-plausible arguments and they're like, well, okay, this sounds good. I guess I can be okay with that. And then they're, off to an ag hearing or a tax meeting or something like that. So, some of the things the talking points that I hear on a regular basis are things like, well, under National Popular Vote, we'll have more people turn out to vote, and that's a better form of democracy when you have more people voting. And as a general rule, I kind of like that general idea: more people turning out, more people involved in our democracy. That is a good thing. But when you start looking at the reality of what it is that they're basing their claims on, you find it really quickly falls apart. Their basic argument is that if you look at a couple of studies, they claim to show that turnout is higher in so-called battleground states than it is in states that are not battlegrounds. And it's plausible, and there's a grain of truth to it. But when you start looking into it, which again, most state legislators don't have the time or the staff or the resources to really dive deep into this, what you find is that there's really not much connection between presidential campaigns and turnout. Many states that have the highest turnout aren't in fact battleground states. Minnesota, which has not been a battleground state for some time, has the highest turnout. And more importantly, I think when you look at the off-cycle elections, so 2018, 2014, 2010, what you find is that the states that have the highest turnout in presidential years also typically have the highest turnout in non-presidential years. They just have political and civic cultures in which more people feel like it's important that they turn out to vote. It has very little to do with the presidential election process. But of course, to a state legislator who, again, has many other issues, that they're trying to deal with, this kind of seems like an important thing, and so maybe they're going to be more interested in the compact. Another one of my favorites that there's one study out there, I think, that they've tortured the data enough to show that states that have or states that are battleground states get more disaster declarations from FEMA. And this is one of their big talking points. Oh, if only we, had national popular vote and not the Electoral College, then we, would not have this unfairness in which states get disaster declarations. Again, sounds kind of plausible. We're all familiar with the way politics can sometimes work. It's not always pretty. But if you actually just go and take the time to count all of the disaster declarations by state over the last 20 years, which is what I did over several hours, it turns out that most of the states that lead in the number of disaster declarations actually aren't battleground states. The top state by far was Oklahoma. New York, California were, I think, the number 2 and the number 3 states. Of the top 11 or 12 states in terms of the number of disaster declarations, only one of them was a battleground state, and that was Florida, which kind of makes sense if you think about it as the only state in the union that is subject to both Atlantic and Gulf hurricanes. But it takes time to take a look at these talking points that their lobbyists are offering and really understand that there's not much, if anything, to them. And that's time that state legislators don't really have. And so they kind of, very often just go with these plausible sounding talking points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both of those examples that you gave, I think, are just, classic examples where you use the phrase torturing the data. You can torture data to show all kinds of things, but you go and you actually just look at it as you've done, Sean, and you say, wait a second, this is not, I mean, it just sort of a glance at what is actually going on shows you that it's not what the national popular vote folks claim it is. The second question, some of these national popular vote lobbyists are actually former Republican officials who now are, paid flacks for the national popular vote interstate compact. And it seemed like for a while they were getting some traction with Republican state legislators, but that seems to be going away. Sean, I'm curious what you think is happening there.
Yeah, I think that they were doing a really good job getting in and talking with state legislators in states that, frankly, we were kind of not really paying that much attention to because we thought, the Republicans in this state, they'll understand that national popular vote is a bad idea, so we don't need to go and educate them on this. And that was a real mistake on our part. And what their lobbyists were able to do is put together this really slick pitch that basically makes the argument that national popular vote would be good for Republicans, that the Republican candidate for president would be more likely to win under national popular vote, that down ballot Republican office holders running for Congress and state legislature, places like California and New York and Illinois, that they would benefit as well from the increased Republican turnout that they promise. And so for a while, they were having some success with that. Usually what would happen would be some Republicans would sign on to it, and then grassroots Republican activists or even just, regular voters would get wind that their Republican state legislator was trying to give away their electoral votes. And a lot of times that would be enough for the Republican to back off. But we've really had to step up our outreach and education and make sure that Republicans understand, one, the pitch that this is supposed to be good for Republicans has got a lot of holes in it as well. It's a lot of those things that it sounds plausible on its face, but then when you start looking under the numbers, it very quickly falls apart. And so
John,
I think that,
do you think what I've noticed about some of that pitch, it seems to rely on things that the Democrats used to say about why Democrats were ultimately going to become completely dominant in elections because of demographics. And Is that right? I mean, it seems like these claims, it's like you have Republican lobbyists using old Democrat talking points to claim that Republicans are somehow doomed unless they change the rules. I mean, I don't know. Is that an oversimplification?
No, I think that's a big part of their pitch. They, along with a number of Democrats, sort of took to heart the idea that America was, inexorably trending to the left, and as that happened, the Democrats would just have such a massive advantage in the Electoral College that no Republican could ever hope to compete. And I think that you're right, that NPV's Republican lobbyists really bought into this and, really made that a part of their pitch. And I think that we're seeing that whole theory is really just crumbling and falling apart. The Democratic pollster who sort of came up, I think, initially with, or is popularly thought of having come up with this idea, the emerging Democratic majority, I think was the book written by Roy Teixeira. I'm not sure about the pronunciation there, but he's actually backed off of that now. He said, I didn't really say what people thought I said, and even what I did actually say, I kind of think I was wrong and overstated the case. Now, we have a very competitive two-party system. The Republicans are evolving and adapting in ways that make them competitive, and the Democrats are evolving and adapting in ways that make them competitive in some ways and less competitive in other ways. I mean, as you know well, our political system is a system of constant adaptation. States that were safe, 3 cycles ago are now very competitive, and states that were competitive a while ago, no longer are. It's a constant dynamic, and I think that what some Democrats in the early part of this century, and NPV's lobbyists today, certainly the Republican ones, have really bought into the idea that our politics are frozen, that the coalitions that we have today or the coalitions that existed 10 years ago, that's permanent. That's just the way things are. And this is part of their sales pitch to Republicans. We need this national popular vote because we're never going to be able to win under the existing system. And I think that most people have sort of realized that that's just not the case.
And one of the things I know we've seen is that, the national popular vote has claimed to be bipartisan. The reality is there's almost no Republicans willing to support it anymore who aren't, or aren't paid members of the national popular vote lobbying team. On the other hand, you've got a lot of Democrats who are opposed to national popular vote. Talk about what you see from their, what's their perspective? Because obviously a lot of Democrat grassroots think that, if you could just get rid of the Electoral College, then everything would be much better. But why do you find Democrat state legislators opposing NPV?
Yeah, and that is one of the big misconceptions about this, that Democrats are all for, or almost all for, the national popular vote. And, what I've been hearing and talking to Democrats for over a decade on this issue, and, there's no doubt that this does have a little bit more appeal to Democrats. I think that some of that is partisanship. They saw Bush elected and they think, oh, if we just didn't have the Electoral College, then Gore would have won. And same dynamic with Trump and Clinton. But that is not at all a unanimous or even a predominant belief. I talk with Democrats all the time who, some of them start talking about the Federalist Papers and, the founding framers got it right, and we're not any smarter than they were. And some of them, frankly, they're not really fans of the Electoral College, but they just look at the compact and they're state legislators. They've been through elections. They know how these things work. And they just see all of the potential problems. I had one Democratic state legislator a couple of days ago I was talking with, and she said, I'd get rid of the Electoral College if I could, but this national popular vote thing is just ridiculous. And we talked about, some of the problems with it just from a technical nature. And I run into a lot of Democrats who are, maybe kind of ambivalent or even leaning against the Electoral College, but they just look at the compact and they say, this thing will be a disaster. And I do also talk to Democrats who say, the founding fathers got it right, and this ensures that my state is represented in the presidential election process, and I'm not willing to disenfranchise the voters of my state so that we can let other states dictate who gets our electoral votes.
So what you said just a moment ago is a great segue to question number 4 here with Sean Parnell on our six questions podcast at Save Our States. Sean, you mentioned the details of presidential elections, the process, and the fact that some state legislators who understand elections reject the national popular vote interstate compact for that reason. What happens in a presidential election after election day? What is this process? And let's run through that, and then maybe I'll kind of insert a question 4.5, which is why, what would national popular vote try to do to this process, and why is that a problem? But let's just walk through this real quickly. I mean, people all go to the polls, they cast ballots, then what happens?
Yeah, so obviously the ballots are counted. There's processes in every state for counting the ballots. In many states, auditing the process to make sure that they haven't left out a precinct or miscounted anything. And then those results are transmitted to the Secretary of State, usually in most states, or whoever the top election official is. And that person is responsible then for also, it might not be an official audit, but they go through the returns, they make sure, they've got every county, or ideally they make sure they have every county, and that, the numbers all line up and that things look good. And then they will certify the winning slate of electors who won, received the most votes in that state. And then they, send, just like they do with state legislators and the governor and other elected officials, they send a notification saying, congratulations, you've been elected to this office of presidential elector, and your duty is to show up at the state capitol on, this particular day and come and cast your vote. And then the electors, of course, show up, they cast their vote, there's some paperwork to be filled out, and that paperwork is then sent to several places actually, but the most important, I guess, would be the president of the U.S. Senate, who holds on to that, and then that is what is opened on January 6th and is counted in the presence of the joint session of Congress.
So, as I said, kind of a sneaky question 4.5 on our 6 Questions podcast. How does that work with national popular vote? I mean, they claim that everything just stays the same. It's no big deal. Where does this process get different if the NPV compact took effect?
Yeah, the biggest difference is that, right now the chief election official looks at the votes in their own state and declares, the winning slate to be whichever slate received the most votes in the states within their own jurisdiction. Under national popular vote, that official is supposed to obtain and calculate the vote totals for every other state as well. And that's where the real problems start to arise. The compact is kind of vague in some ways and very specific in other ways if you kind of understand what it is that they're talking about. But basically, the Secretary of State or whoever the chief election official is for each state is supposed to either use the certificate of ascertainment that every state is supposed to produce, or a final certified statewide tally. The problems with that would be that those documents were never intended to be aggregated. For example, you have states that use ranked choice voting, and that creates its own set of problems because you've got 2 different vote totals for each candidate under ranked choice voting. You also have the fact that the certificates of ascertainment that some states provide aren't necessarily accurate. The biggest miss on this would have been New York State in 2012, where they left off about 415,000 votes because they simply were not done counting all of the votes yet. And they've been consistently off for the last 4 presidential elections by tens or hundreds of thousands of votes. So, there are other problems as well, all of which ultimately wind up giving the chief election official in an NPV state a pretty broad degree of latitude to, essentially decide the election the way they want to. once they get to start bringing in vote totals from other states and deciding which they'll accept and which they might reject and which they might have to estimate. Last year, I think it was, a national popular vote lobbyist in South Dakota was talking about how the election official gets to estimate vote totals if for some reason the certificate of ascertainment isn't available or doesn't have those numbers. And that's a pretty scary scenario, I think.
That's pretty bizarre, the idea that an election official would estimate numbers in order to determine a winner. I want to drill into one of the things that you mentioned there is this question number 5 about ranked choice voting and national popular vote, because we've seen Maine and now Alaska planning to use ranked choice voting to choose their presidential electors in 2024. There could be other states. It's, this change to how elections work is proposed in a number of places around the country. But this is not compatible with national popular vote. To me, this seems really simple, but I know that we've ran into people who find it very confusing. So, Sean, explain why ranked choice voting and national popular vote are just entirely incompatible.
Sure, and I'll start by explaining ranked choice voting very briefly. Basically, right now, when you and I walk into the voting booth, we put a check mark or fill in an oval next to one candidate for one office, and that's it. Under ranked choice voting, if you have multiple candidates, you get to rank them. You get to say, well, this is my first choice vote, but if they're eliminated because they perform poorly in the first round of the vote counting, then this is my second choice vote. So I might, walk into the voting booth and rank the Libertarian as my top candidate, and then I might rank the Constitution Party candidate as my second, and then rank the Republican as my third place. And as those lower, when they count all of the votes, the candidate who receives the least first place votes, they get knocked out. And in this case, let's say it was the Libertarian. My vote for my second place vote for the Conservative Party candidate or Constitution Party candidate then gets counted for that candidate. And this process goes on until somebody eventually has a majority of at least all of the candidates, of all of the votes that still remain at that point. So ranked choice voting produces at least 2 different vote counts for the candidates. It produces the first place, everybody's first place votes. It's going to have the Libertarian and the Green and the Constitution and all of these third party candidates, as well as the Democrat and the Republican. But then after the ranking process is complete, there's a final vote tally that can be tens or even hundreds of thousands of votes different for the final 2 candidates. Under national popular vote, there's really no guidance. There's really nothing that would require that election official in a state who's trying to determine what the vote counts are from, let's say, Maine. There's nothing that says you have to use the first place rankings or you have to use the last, the final vote tally that's only come down to the last 2 candidates. So it gives them the opportunity to potentially, and there's really no legal reason why someone would have to choose one over the other. It's completely arbitrary. It gives them the opportunity to decide which vote totals they want to use, even when that decision can change the outcome of the election. The other problem with ranked choice voting is what happens when you have a third party candidate or an independent candidate who finishes ahead of either the Democrat or the Republican. In that scenario, what happens is that, let's say it's the Democrat who finishes in third place, they potentially wind up having 0 votes recorded coming out of that state for them because, of course, the third party candidate, their votes get eliminated, get erased, and they then get reallocated to either the Republican or the independent candidate, depending on how people cast their ranked choice ballot.
And that's far from theoretical, right? I mean, in 1992, in our lifetime, Bill Clinton came in third place in Utah, and George H.W. Bush came in third place in Maine. So, in that election, had those states been using ranked choice voting, Bill Clinton would have had a couple 100,000 votes just deleted from his national total. And George H.W. Bush would have had over 100,000 votes just deleted from his national total in that election. And I mean, that is not mathematically defensible. It's not democratic. It's essentially just arbitrary.
Yeah, it's completely arbitrary. And if you think about some of the close elections we've had, and by my count, 4 of the last 16 elections have been close elections. When you start shifting, a couple 100,000 votes here and there, you are potentially changing the outcome, or at least you are giving the chief election officials in national popular vote states the essentially unchecked power to decide, well, I'm going to take this set of votes out of Utah because it completely zeroes out the Democrats' votes there, because the Libertarian Party candidate came in second place and they're using ranked choice voting. It really does give tremendous power in the case of a close national election, which is, frankly, when you start counting things like the number of undervotes and overvotes that litigation could potentially disqualify or rule back in, and the same thing with absentee ballots and provisional ballots. Really, anything under a couple million vote margin is going to be considered a close election in terms of the arbitrary decisions of these state officials being able to decide for themselves who it is that won the presidential election.
Yeah, scary prospect. Sean Parnell, Senior Legislative Director for Save Our States. Our last question, of course, is always the same. Who is your favorite founding father and why?
So there's a part of me that wants to say James Wilson, because he is, of course, the first delegate to the Constitutional Convention who proposed using electors to elect the president. But I do have to stick with probably a very popular choice, George Washington, largely because he was literally offered, more or less the kingship of the new country in many ways, a couple of times, both during his military career and after. And every time he declined, he understood what he was fighting for, and he understood that the principles of democracy were very important, and that putting his ambition ahead of the nation's was just something that he was not willing to entertain. And so for that, he's my favorite, with James Wilson as maybe my fallback choice.
Very nice. Sean, thank you so much for joining me on 6 Questions.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of our viewers and listeners out there. Thanks for being a part of Save Our States on Facebook or wherever you have found our podcast here. We're glad that you're a part of what we do, what Sean does, what I do, and the rest of the team here at Save Our States. We can't do it without you taking the materials that we produce, sharing them with other people, educating people about why our nation of states, why our electoral college process is so instrumental to preserving the liberty, the prosperity that we all hold so dear. So thank you so much, and we'll be back with another 6 Questions podcast.